So bias binding is used in lots of ways, but we are looking at how we'll just use it to hem some shorts. There are some bias bound pajama pant hems. Work out which is the straight grain and therefore which is the bias grain. It's easy on a check, but if you actually fold your fabric like so, you can easily work out the bias. So that's the straight grain, the red arrow, and the yellow is the bias. So for my widest bias binding, I'm going to cut a strip on the bias that's 5.5 centimeters wide. See, I've measured that same distance a number of times, and I am now going to cut along those yellow chalk marks. So you should have lots of strips now that will be able to go through the bias binding maker. But what you may need to do if your strips are quite short and you need a long piece of bias binding is join two strips together. So have a play with how you organise your angles to have a continuous strip. So to join two strips together and make a continuous piece of seam allowance or a longer piece, what you need to do is make sure you join the two ends. Just have a play with it so that you get it right. But you can position it, then sew it down with 1 centimetre seam allowance so that you have a continuous strip of bias binding. Make sure you open out the seams. So pressing open your seam allowances will make sure that the bulk is reduced. So just feed through your strip through the bias binding maker and press as you go. So you can buy pre-made bias binding tape, but you won't be able to get it in the fabric you want or the width necessarily that you want. So where the iron folds are will eventually be where you stitch. So position the binding on the hem that you're about to bind and stitch in that iron mark. So to get a correct join where they overlap again, put your first piece back and then your second piece, or the part that's looping around, over the top of the first, and then it'll be a perfect join. So this is the hem of my shorts, and I could just subtly put my bias binding on the inside and not have it visible at all from the outside, or I could have it so it is visible. So the binding has wrapped around both sides of the hem and looks good.